Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Bonsoir, mesdames, messieurs. Welcome to the Royal. Bienvenue au Royal. For those that don't know me, my name is George Weber, and I'm the President and Chief Executive Officer of the Royal Ottawa Mental Health Centre and the Brockville Mental Health Centre. We're delighted to see all of you out tonight, the first lecture of our fall series. And as you know, every month, except for in the summer months, we have a lecture which we think is of interest to the public, or the public has asked for us for further knowledge and information. What is the latest research, the latest evidence dealing with a number of mental health and addiction issues. So we're pleased that you've agreed to join us for this evening, which will be a very interesting session. A session, as you know, is titled The Ottawa Police and the Royal Sexual Behaviours Clinic, Aiming for Zero. And a little bit about the session tonight. It's really about the collaborative work between the Ottawa Police Force, and the Royal's Sexual Behaviour Clinic, and the Ottawa Police Forces, in particular the unit, the High Risk Offender Unit. Dr. Paul Fedorov will be the moderator tonight, and I'll introduce him more fully in a moment. And he will begin the presentations with the overview of innovative work being done here within the Sexual Behaviours Clinic, and the common goals of the clinic and the High Risk Offender Unit of the Ottawa Police Force. Then it'll be followed by Staff Sergeant Dana Reynolds and Detective Mark Horton, who will discuss the role of their team in the community-based management of high-risk sexual offenders, and more specifically, they will be discussing the role of the unit and common legal designations utilized for high-risk sexual offenders. Then will be completed by Lisa Murphy, who is the coordinator for the Sexual Behaviours Clinic, and she will provide an overview of sex offender registries and public notifications, and make comparisons between the approaches used in Canada and the United States. And then following their presentations, they'll come up here and we'll have a panel discussion, and we'll respond to any questions you have. We hope that the session, well, it depends on the interest, will be finished at around 8:30. But some of these sessions have gone on for 9 o'clock and then continue in the hallway for hours thereafter. But anyways, it's up to you. This is to increase your knowledge and understanding of this topic. So I'd like to introduce I'm going to do it this way. Instead of introducing each individual speaker when they get up to speak, I'm going to introduce all 4 speakers at this, one by one right at the beginning. So Dr. Paul Fedorov is going to lead off, and Paul has been at the Royal a very long time. Paul is the director of our Forensic Program Sexual Behaviours Clinic and the head of Forensic Division of the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Ottawa. He's also the Vice Chair of the Royal's Research Ethics Committee and has been a Director of the Forensic Research Unit at the Royal's Institute of Mental Health Research and Chair of the Sex Offender Committee, the American Academy of Psychiatry and Law, and the President of the Canadian Association of Psychiatry and the Law. I could go on, and it's just, I'll take up a half an hour to read his full resume, so let me just start there. He's a well-known, world-renowned researcher and clinician in this area, and has all kinds of awards, both Canadian and international awards, and numerous publications in this area. So we're just delighted to have him as part of the Royals team. Thank you very much, Paul. Then we'll be followed by Staff Sergeant Dana Reynolds of the Ottawa Police Force. She has been with the Ottawa Police for 20 years and has worked in the fields of domestic violence, patrol, prostitution investigations, and currently manages the John School, watch out guys, and is the chair of the board of directors for Operation Come Home. Dan is responsible for the High Risk Offender Management Unit, which includes Missing Person Unit, the Mental Health Unit, which we work with very, very closely, the Dangerous Offender, Long-Term Offender Unit, High Risk Releases, and the Major Case Management VICLES section. Maybe you can explain what the VICLES section is in one due course. So we're delighted to have Dana with us tonight. She will also be, it's going to be a team approach from the Ottawa Police Force, and her colleague tonight is Detective Mark Horton, who's an 18-year veteran of the Ottawa Police Service and currently assigned as an investigator in the High Risk Offender Management Unit. Mark has served throughout the ranks of the Ottawa Police Force and has been seconded to outside agencies on 3 occasions, including 2 years with the Correctional Service of Canada as the Ottawa Area Community Corrections Liaison Officer. Prior to joining the police service, Mark worked with the Correctional Service of Canada as an institutional parole officer at Joyceville Institution and Spring Hill Institution. And he graduated in Carleton University in '93 with a degree in sociology with a concentration in criminology, a very well-qualified individual to address us tonight. And last but not least is Lisa Murphy, who's received her Master's in Criminology from the University of Ottawa after receiving a Bachelor of Social Sciences honors in Major Criminology and Psychology. She is the Sexual Behaviors Clinic Coordinator and manages the Sexual Behaviors Assessment Laboratory. Prior to this, she worked as a research analyst at the RCMP National Child Exploitation Coordination Center. And she has conducted research and presented extensively on assessment, treatment, and mechanisms of community-based management of sex offenders. And she's testified in a number of court cases and things of this nature. And again, all 4 of them, Lisa included, have a long list of a lot of other achievements and accomplishments. So without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Paul Fedorov to start the session. Thank you.
Thanks, George, and I'm really happy to be here today. I'm the director of the Sexual Behaviors Clinic at the Royal, and this is the 3rd of the conversations at the Royal that we've done, and I think it's going to be a very interesting one, and you'll see why in a minute. What I want to do right now is just kind of set the scene for you in terms of what how I see things, and I hope maybe give you some things to think about today as well. I'd like to start off with this slide from Jurastat, which is part of Stats Canada, and it talks about the financial costs of child abuse in Canada. And this number here is $15 billion per year. And I just want to point out, this is only financial cost and neglects the actual cost that we as a society and our children bear from child abuse of all types, including child sexual abuse. And the Sexual Behaviors Clinic is devoted to preventing this and aiming to reduce the costs of child abuse to 0, as well as the incidence. And we're going to, I hope, tell you a little bit about how we're going to try and do that. This is the Royal Ottawa about 100 years ago. And it looked just like this when I got here, although it wasn't exactly 100 years ago when I arrived. But it was an asylum, literally. It was built as a place that people with tuberculosis went. In those days, tuberculosis was a more or less incurable disease with a 50% mortality rate within 5 years. And the treatment was to get people as far away from the community as possible. And if you think about it, that's sort of how we think about sex offenders these days. But things do change, and as you know, we're now in a very beautiful new building. We've moved away from the idea of asylum, treating people with mental illness or mental health problems by putting them away, and talked about helping them to become productive members of the community. And that's how I tend to think about sex offenders and people who may become sex offenders. I just wanted to show you a little bit of data that was put together by one of my colleagues, Dr. Brad Booth, who is also working in the Sexual Behaviors Clinic. And it shows something that's known as the Penrose effect. And these are old data, but it shows the numbers of people in mental hospitals and the number of people in prisons. And you can see that there is a crossover here. What happened is that we decided to deinstitutionalize people that were in mental hospitals, and that proceeded at a great rate. But you can see that as that happened, the number of people that ended up in prisons increased almost at the same rate. And you can see that the numbers in general are the same, but what was happening is that we were moving from one asylum to another. That's kind of takes us up to 2000, And I think that we are now becoming much better at keeping people with mental illness out of prisons. We're not there yet. But I think that we are now at a point where we can actually move from third order treatment, where we're looking at people that are very ill, to actually going to first order treatment, in which we look at preventing people from becoming ill in the first place. And that's what I'd like you to start thinking about in terms of preventing, rather than just treating sex offenders or locking them up, actually looking at how we can prevent sex offenses from ever happening in the first place. And I think our next speakers are going to show you how we're starting to do that. Last point I want to make is that people sometimes think that we're on opposite sides, that the police are out there arresting people and we're here trying to keep people from going to jail. And it's really not that way at all. We're really part of the same team with the same aim, coming at it from slightly different angles. But I think you're going to see from this evening how closely we've learned to work together, and how I think that will help us all to reach the same aim, which is to prevent child abuse of all types forever.
All right, good evening, everybody. Thanks again for coming and listening to our presentation, which is sort of new and innovative, as Dr. Fedorov pointed out. I'm just going to do a little intro about our section, because Mark is going to do a little bit more of the in-depth stuff. I'm the manager of the section, so it seems logical that I'll give you a broader perspective, and he'll tell you the details about what we do and why we do it. So, to give you an idea, the high-risk offender unit, as was explained, has a couple of different areas, including missing persons, mental health, stuff like that. But the high-risk release is the office that Mark works out of. And we have a bunch of other sections that are all kind of working together. So the way that we have to sort of look at it is the idea that these people are coming out anyways. So the ones that are being released whether we like it, agree with it. It doesn't much matter. They're coming out, and so we need to prepare for that and try to support them in their reintegration into society. So that's part of our plan, and it's kind of like the whole idea of taking a community to raise a child. It's going to take a community to support these people and not have them reoffend. So we can't do that by ourselves. The community can't do it by themselves, and certainly Dr. Fedorov's team can't do it by themselves either. So the mixed bag for us is that we're also in the profession of enforcement. So we do have a lot of hats that we wear when dealing with this type of community member, this type of offender. And I think the section I have kind of does all of it. So we have our dangerous offender, long-term offender officer. That's two people that work at the courthouse, and they work on the early end. So their job is to work with the Crown Attorney's Office and to identify people that maybe should be considered for a dangerous offender or long-term offender designation, which holds people in custody sometimes indefinitely. So that would be decided by a judge. And that's determined by a pattern of offenses that they've had leading up to it. So I have two people that work there. They're at the very beginning. They're looking at people that are reoffending, that are exhibiting a pattern of violence, and that are believed to be a very high risk to the community. And then they also do the preparation for that hearing, which is a very lengthy hearing, and it includes people, it starts from their childhood. So this is a different kind of hearing than what you would see for a normal trial about one specific event. This includes where the person started, all of the treatment they've had, all of their offenses, and where they're at now to come to a decision about whether they do fit the dangerous offender or long-term offender designation. Then I have the sex offender registry section. So I have a registrar who does the registrations, and Lisa's going to talk to you a lot more about what the registry requirements are. There is a national and a provincial registry, and the police have responsibility for managing that. So we have a certain amount of time to register people, and we have a certain amount of time to confirm their addresses. And annually, we are responsible for verifying their addresses. So I have a small unit that verifies addresses and does the registrations, and we meet weekly to discuss who's been registered, who's coming up, who's non-compliant, who's missing, tracking them down, figuring out where they are. It's a lot of work. It's a lot of offenders. There's over 500 in the city, and we manage closer to 800. So it's a lot of people, and it's a fairly small unit, so it's a lot of work. Then we have the high-risk releases, which is where Mark works with one other officer, and they're the ones that work kind of more in a partnership with the offenders, believe it or not. So they're not on the enforcement side unless somebody needs to be held accountable for their actions. So their job is actually to build a relationship with these people and hold them accountable when they make a mistake, if that's deemed to be the most appropriate action. So they work with them when they come out. They often meet with them before they even come out of jail to introduce themselves and to set up a plan to try to manage them once they're released. Ideal situation, they call Mark and Ron all the time. They each have a certain number of offenders that they're managing, and these people call them all the time to tell them what they're doing, to check in with them. And these are the highest risk people. These are people that are dangerous offenders, long-term offenders, or that are on an 810, which Mark will explain to you. So that's how we're working to try to manage them, and we have other community partners that help us with that. I also have somebody that did the job Mark did that works in the corrections world, so that's a secondment, and that person works at the parole office. So that is our partnership with the parole office. We have discussions about people that are coming out. We provide advice on whether they should be released to Ottawa, whether we recommend that they do or don't come to Ottawa based on what their support plan is, which housing they're going to have. And we also provide information to the parole officers as well as security for them if they need to go do door knocks and visits, and they often have offenders coming in to meet with them that sometimes they might like an officer to come and sit with them in their office. It's very helpful for them, and it's very helpful for us in the police world. So that's another one I have. And then the ROPE team, so that's our Repeat Offender Parolee Enforcement Program. It's partnership within the province. So it's run through the OPP, and we all provide officers, and those are for the guys that decide, screw this, I'm out of here. You know, they don't want to, either they've breached the parole conditions by having drugs or alcohol in their urine sample, or they just take off. You know, they're supposed to come back, they're living in a halfway house or some sort of a transition home, and they breach their conditions. And they're believed to be a risk to the community because they're on some sort of supervision while they're in the community. So these are the guys that go out and just plain catch the bad guys. So they research them, they find out where they hang out, who they hang out with, and they track them down and bring them back to jail. So that's kind of a fun job if you like police work, but very different. So you can see how there's a whole variety of roles that the different officers play within the same office, and all with the same goal, that we are trying to prevent offenses and re-offenses. So unfortunately, the policing world is not heavily invested into prevention. We just don't probably have the resources because we're trying to catch too many people that are committing crimes, but we tend to deal with them after the fact, after they're already offenders, and that's where we're trying to prevent recidivism. So some of our community partners, and this is where the Royal Ottawa comes in, but it can't really be understated. This is the way of our future. A lot of our government agencies, anybody that works in a government agency that is not privately funded knows that there's a lot of cuts to everything. So we're all being asked to do more with less, do more with less, do more with less. And at the same time, the needs of society are increasing. As you saw, the number of people that are in hospitals, I mean, there's a reason why I have a mental health unit now that's extremely busy. All those people that used to be in hospitals are generally out on the street now. And that's just one small problem that we have. So we need to work together, and we need to really lean on our community partners. So that's some of the largest successes that we have are based on that model, and I think you'll see that model increasing as time goes on for all of us. Our mental health unit is a partnership with the Ottawa Hospital, and it's very successful. So we work with the Crown Attorney's Office. Obviously, you know, they help us prepare for court, they help us work on dangerous offender applications, they help us prepare 810 applications. They're a huge partner for us. Probation and parole, same thing. You know, we have people working there. We talk to them every day. We're all dealing with the same people, and they're trying to do the same thing. They're meeting with their offenders all the time, trying to keep them on the right path. And if they think somebody's kind of going astray, they'll call Mark or Ron. We'll have a discussion about what we can do. And generally, you know, prevention is the goal, trying to catch people when we're starting to see early signs that they're going back to their old patterns or that they're not following instructions. And we try to work with them early on, and we support the Probation Parole Office, and they support us as well. COSA, which some of the members are here, so that's a community agency that supports basically high-risk offenders, parolees that are coming out without much support in the community. So Mark will explain a little bit about the terminology, but some people come out from warrant expiry, which means that they were not paroled. And generally they weren't paroled because they're too dangerous to be released. But everybody does reach the end of their sentence, and when they do, if you're paroled, you get all kinds of support. You get housing, you get counseling, you get everything that you need, basically, and a worker to keep up with, to call, to get advice. If you don't get paroled and you reach warrant expiry, you get nothing. So it doesn't logically make sense. They're the most dangerous offenders, and they're coming out with no support. So this organization provides them support, and their goal is to also hold them accountable for their actions while supporting them in their reintegration to society. So if you picture somebody that's been in prison for 10 years, they come out, they don't have family, they don't have friends, they don't have a home, they don't have a job, they've probably never seen an iPhone, you know, they're a little bit out of their element, to say the least, and they're much higher risk to reoffend when they're dropped like that. And nobody's following up with them, supporting them, and holding them accountable. So that is a really important role that COSA plays. We've been working the last few years with the Royal Ottawa, and we meet regularly, and you know, as much as we can't discuss specific individuals, we can discuss our mandates and make sure that we're on the same page and we're working together. If we have concerns about how things are running, we can certainly address them together, and we can openly discuss concerns about people without mentioning their names. So that's something that we have built on, and I think we have a really good relationship going on. We certainly hear from them if there's concerns from the offenders about how things are going, and if we were hearing from the offenders about the program and had concerns, we would call them as well to say, you know, we're hearing this and it doesn't really sound too good from our perspective. I wouldn't hesitate to call and say, you know, is this what you guys are doing? Is this what you guys are saying? Is this what you're teaching? If it doesn't really work for us, and they do the same. If the offenders are coming in saying we're not being treated fairly, or, you know, the police are saying this, they'll just call us and ask us, and we work it through so that we're always on the same page. And that helps us keep people accountable as well, because they can't play us against each other, right? The John Howard Society looks after housing for the most part. So when offenders come out, obviously they need somewhere to live, and that's something that's lacking for some people, and that's a real concern for us, because if you're coming out of prison and you're homeless, your chances of success are significantly lower than if you have a place to live. Like, that's a basic necessity, I think. Pavlov, and you know, it would be agreed that certainly on your hierarchy of needs, that's pretty basic. You need food, you need shelter, and there are people that come out with none, but John Howard Society has some really good programs and supportive housing for people coming out. So we work with them. And I will introduce Mark Horton. He's a detective that works in the high-risk release office, and he'll give you a little more detail about what they do and how it works, because it is kind of a confusing world of parolees and different designations and court applications and stuff, but he'll try to make it simple for you. Mark?
So I have a few slides that don't necessarily discuss our mandate per se, but I need to give you a little bit of background and some language knowledge so that you understand what we're talking about when I do discuss our mandate. And it'll also kind of illustrate to you how much time we spend in my section working with other agencies. I would say off the top that myself and my partner spend probably 80% of our time dealing with agencies that are not the Ottawa Police Service, be it probation or parole or community NGOs or what have you. We work primarily outside of the police world. We become the point of contact for these organizations. So this is just a list of our primary mandate. We kind of have four main hits for the things that we do. We review and prepare, that would be the criminal code, 810.1, 810.2 applications. The 810 is just the number of the criminal code section that it refers to, and what it is a peace bond or a judicial restraint order where conditions are imposed on someone in the community prior to them actually committing any offense. And I'll explain to that in a minute. We also manage those individuals the way a probation or parole officer would. We're kind of a dysfunctional probation officer because we have enforcement obligations, but we don't have a lot of resources, which is why we rely on the outside agencies. We're the primary point of contact for provincial probation officers for their intensive supervision clients, and we assist them in the supervision of those clients. We work with the federal corrections, parole officers, investigating long-term supervision order breaches, and we lay charges if they're necessary. Our section is technically responsible for managing the Ontario and the National Sex Offender Registry, but over the last year and a half, with the support of our chain of command, we've actually developed that into its own kind of entity that has its own staff, and so we've gone from kind of one person looking after it to a team of about 4 officers and civilians that are looking after that. We're also part of the development of the community safety plan and any community notifications, which will be discussed a little bit later, but I'll touch on it now. So this is a little bit of background. Probation and parole in 30 seconds or less, but it'll probably take longer than that. So this is just to kind of explain the Canadian judicial system for those that may kind of have a TV understanding of it. So we're referring specifically to someone who's been found guilty of a criminal offense and what the sentencing options are once the guilty verdict has been found. So anyone who is given a sentence that's a non-custodial, so a probation or a suspended or conditional sentence, or anyone who receives a custodial sentence less than 2 years, we've all heard the term 2 years less a day, so less than a 2-year sentence or a non-custodial, that's looked after by the province. The province has its own correctional system with probation officers and provincial jails, and those are all managed by the province. Anyone who receives a custodial sentence that's longer than 2 years, or 2 years or more, that becomes a responsibility of the Federal Correctional Service of Canada. They run the penitentiary, and they have parole offices spread out throughout the country in large communities. So provincial would be short sentences, probation, conditional sentences, house arrest, shorter, less significant, but still important sentencing options. The federal sentences that are 2 years or longer, they have gradual release programs that are actually written into the law, the Corrections and Conditional Release Act. So I think we've probably all heard of day parole and full parole. Day parole and full parole are earned releases. So the offender has to demonstrate to the Parole Board of Canada that they deserve to be released early, and when they are released early on day parole or full parole, it's usually bound by a number of conditions that they have to abide by, and then they would report to a federal parole officer in the community. Statutory release is a release that is statutory. It's written into the law. Everyone in Canada who's serving a custodial sentence that has an end date, so not a life sentence, is required to be released into the community after they serve 2/3 of their sentence. That's referred to as statutory release. So they serve the last third of their sentence in the community, being supervised by a parole officer. They've also got a lot of resources. Halfway houses are available if they require accommodations, or if they have a condition to reside at a halfway house. Employment counseling, psychiatrists and psychologists, programming in the community. They have employment supports. So there's a lot of services that are offered by the Correctional Service of Canada or their contracted agencies to support these day parole, full parole, and stat release offenders. They also have what we call stat release with residency. So that's a person who is at the high end of the danger spectrum, but can still be managed in the community, but they have a condition to reside at a halfway house during the entire period of their release in the community. So they're kind of one step into the community outside the penitentiary. Just for reference sake, everybody understands life sentences in Canada. A life sentence in Canada is actually a life sentence. We hear terms life 25 or life 15, and people believe that means that that person's sentence is over in 25 years, and that's not true. A life sentence in Canada is a life sentence. You're under a warrant for the rest of your natural life. The 15 or 10 or 25 refers to when someone is eligible to be considered for parole into the community. It doesn't mean they will be released on those dates. But when I worked with the parole officers in the Federal Correctional Service, we would actually have to go out to nursing homes and hospices to meet with offenders who were serving life sentences in the community who had to meet with their parole officer, even though they were living in a hospice, because they're subject to that sentence for the rest of their life. So a lot of people don't realize that. They hear life 25 and they think it's 25 years, but it's not. If you have a life sentence, you're subject to that warrant for the rest of your life. There are two other sentencing options. Dana briefly touched on them. Dangerous offenders and long-term supervision orders. Dangerous offenders are individuals who did not commit what would be a life sentence offense, like a murder, but have demonstrated a history of violence or a regular pattern of violence, and the Crown can apply to have them designated as a dangerous offender. And if they are successful in that designation, that person can actually be subject to an indeterminate sentence of imprisonment with opportunities for parole, but they're bound by that designation for the rest of their life. One step down from that, if someone doesn't meet the threshold for a dangerous offender but is still found to be particularly dangerous and needs additional supervision, they can be classified a long-term offender, where they will actually be subject to a period of supervision in the community after they finish their sentence. So up to 10 years, and the majority of those long-term orders are actually issued for 8 or 10 years. So someone could be given a 5-year sentence, they would serve out that sentence, receive their parole or their stat release, complete that sentence, and then they would be subject to additional periods of supervision in the community afterwards. That was longer than 30 seconds. Yes?
I just want to make a point of clarification for your non-disclosure less than 2 years, that you can also get parole
Yes.
sentence less than 2
Yep. Yes, there is a parole for provincial offenders. It's not as common. It's not legislated the way it would be as a stat release or something like that, but there is a parole opportunity provincially. We just don't see it very often. It's certainly not as common as a day parole or full parole on a regular sentence or a federal sentence. There's also we don't like to refer to it as a time off for good behavior, but the provincial system does actually calculate a shorter custodial sentence than you may actually be sentenced to, and when you're finished, it's over. There isn't an additional period of supervision afterwards. Good? So that has nothing to do with me. That's all just backgrounder. This is where my section starts to become involved in this system. A breach of a probation condition is a new criminal charge. Someone is charged with breach of probation, they have to go to court and face the music, as it were. In the cases of offenders that are designated as intensive supervision, so they're considered high risk by the provincial probation officers, my section becomes involved in helping them manage them in the community, and in the event of breaches, will actually proceed and lay the charge for the breach of probation. So we get involved in that case. If you're serving a federal sentence and you're supervised by the federal correctional authorities and you breach your parole, that's not a new charge. That just means you go back to jail. And then you're reassessed for release further on in your sentence. Breach your statutory release, no additional charges, back into custody with consideration for future release again. There's actually a bill before the House right now, I think, to change that and to make breach of a probation or breach of a parole condition an actual new criminal charge, but it's very preliminary and it's part of that tough on crime agenda. Breach of a long-term order, so those longer-term supervision orders after the sentence is over. If someone breaches one of those long-term orders, that's a new criminal charge, and that's one of the meat and potatoes parts of my section, where we're called in by the correctional authorities then. We're we're advised of the breach, we conduct a criminal investigation and proceed with a new criminal charge if it's warranted. We don't always charge. It's no one's ever subject to have to be charged for anything, but it's certainly one of the options we have. So Dana touched on this. She kind of took the, the sexy part of my presentation away. This is something, you heard her explain this 5 minutes ago, and you probably went, no, that's silly. She must have got that wrong. The most dangerous inmates in custody, it's less than 5%. It's 97% or 96 point something percent of offenders are released on some form of conditional release into the community, not including life sentences. That very small percentage, it's growing actually, but currently a very small percentage of offenders are judged by the correctional authorities and by the Parole Board of Canada to be too dangerous to be supervised in the community. They're deemed to be so dangerous that a parole officer in the community cannot manage that risk safely and provide a safe environment for the public. Those offenders are detained until the end of their warrant. So they're detained until the very last day of their sentence. When that last day arrives, the Correctional Service opens the front door and lets them out. And that's it. There is no follow-up. There are no resources offered. There is no halfway house bed. There's no counseling. There's no psychiatrist or psychologist. There's no parole officers. There's nothing. The most dangerous individuals are detained to the very last day, and then they are released with no resources. I'll just give you a second to absorb how ridiculous that is. So this is where my section comes in. I mentioned that we review, prepare A10.1, A10.2 peace bonds. So this is a provision in the criminal code that permits us, it permits anyone actually, if you read the section of the criminal code, anyone who has a fear can appear before justice and make an application for one of these peace bonds. Don't get any ideas though. It's mainly us. And what happens is we get the information on these offenders from the Correctional Service before they're released, a lot of their risk assessment and their history in the institution. And we take that information and we prepare a package and we go before a judge and we explain to the judge essentially that we believe this person is at risk to commit either sex offenses against a person under the age of 16 or violent offenses or sex offenses against an adult person. That's the difference between the point 1 and the point 2. We petition the court to have them preemptively impose conditions on an individual. So this person has not yet committed a new crime, but we're asking the court to impose enforceable conditions on that person so that we can help manage them in the community because we feel that the risk is too high for them to just be released without any kind of supervision. So I explain this to people and sometimes they get a little uncomfortable with the fact that we are going to court to have someone bound by conditions that they can be charged for breaching before they've actually committed a new offense. But what this really is a stopgap in the criminal code that gives us an opportunity to provide some kind of supervision or monitoring or management to these individuals that never had the opportunity to do that on parole. They were never released to the community under any supervision. So this becomes the stopgap for that. So this is the majority of what my partner and I do is we prepare these applications and appear before the court to petition the court to impose these conditions, and then we become the de facto probation officer, as it were, dysfunctional probation officer, we say, because we have conditions that are very similar to probation or parole conditions that we would enforce in the community. However, we don't have any resources the way the correctional authorities would have. We don't have a halfway house or halfway house beds available to us in order to put these individuals in the halfway house. We don't have counselors or psychologists or psychiatrists available to us on staff. We don't have programming. We can't do urinalysis testing. What we really do is just try and develop a therapeutic relationship with these individuals so that they feel like, you know, we're there to help them in the community, which in reality we are. We like to pride ourselves in the fact that we gauge our success by the lack of criminal charges that we lay. Because if we're not charging people criminally, it means that we're successful in keeping them on the straight and narrow and they're not going back to an offense cycle. So we are kind of police probation officers. It's a very non-traditional police role and not everybody can do it well because you really have to suspend that police mentality, I think, that a lot of guys have. and you have to adopt a therapeutic mentality or a community supervision, a soft approach. We like to say we work on the honey and vinegar principle, heavy on the honey, light on the vinegar. So we want these guys to be successful. And Dana mentioned a lot of the community resources that we tap into. COSA, John Howard Society, Elizabeth Fry to some extent. We have had some individuals. They're offering services in the community that we have to refer our individual, our subjects to, because we don't have those programs to offer them. So we have to tap into those other agencies. So we really, really rely on those agencies for support. Just quickly, I just want to hit on this very quickly. This is something that people probably have heard of but aren't familiar with. There's a section in the Criminal Code, Section 161, that prohibits individuals who've been sentenced to certain crimes to not attend certain places or be involved in certain types of employment or volunteer work. It's all a preventative order in order to restrict access to potential victims. So if anyone has ever heard of a 161 condition or a 161 order, that's what they're referring to. Community notification, you're going to talk about that? Good.
Switch it up. Okay, now while I pull this up, I feel the need to warn you that not only is my time low, so I'm going to have to fly through my presentation, but I'm widely known for having rapid speech. And that's even worse when I'm excited about what I'm talking about. And I have an unhealthy excitement for sex offender registries. All right, so let me see here. Design. Okay, so I'm going to talk to you guys a little bit today, more of the research and sort of legislative side of things as opposed to the practical things we've been hearing about today. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about sex offender registration and notification. So what is sex offender registry? So we've heard people talk about this tonight. What is it that we're referring to? Essentially, sex offender registries are a database of individuals that have been convicted of a sex crime. So it's a designated crime. And once they serve their sentence, once they're released into the community, they are required to report to local police, provide personal details, and as those details change, so if they move or change their name, they're required to come in and report that information. There's a little bit here in terms of, depending on the jurisdiction and the country, because a number of different countries use this type of legislation, reporting periods can range from 5 years all the way to life. And these are just a little bit of the information that can be collected on registries. Public notification is something that in some countries, there's a system that's linked with your registration system, but in other countries it's separate. So in Canada, we have a separate system of public notification. And the idea here is that an individual is going to be released, possibly somebody who is detained till warrant expiry, and the criminal justice system has determined that this individual is at such a high risk that they need to warn individuals in the community. Now, in making a decision whether or not to do that, one of the big questions is weighing the balance, one of the big things you want to do is balance public safety with the offender's rights to privacy. So it's a constant balance back and forth. So in the United States, what we see is a system where you have a registration system, a public notification system that go hand in hand. So essentially what that means is in the States you see public sex offender registries, so things that you can access via the internet or through formal systems. Within Canada though, what we see is something very different. We see a sex offender registry that is completely private and can only be accessed by the local police, whereas the public notification is completely separate legislation and is very rarely used, which I'll get into a little bit in a sec. So when we look at the rationale for why it is that these systems are utilized, there are a number of different approaches and perspectives. So from a policing perspective, what we see is the idea that a sex offender registry will be good as an investigative tool. So in the event of a child abduction or a sex crime, the police now have this database that they're able to go to and look at various details to try to more efficiently and effectively solve a sex crime or a child abduction. So an individual goes missing and witnesses say the last time a child was saw, there was a brown car of this general make and model, and the individual was tall with dark hair. They're able to search to try to find that type of information, and the idea is that with this list of quote-unquote usual suspects, so individuals who have already responded or who have already offended in the past, they're able to take a look at that and ideally locate the individual from within this list. From more of a research perspective, the idea is that because an individual is on a sex offender registry, they're less likely to go on to recidivate, so go on to commit another offense. So the idea that there's a deterrence there. For both registration and notification, the idea of a critical perspective, so this idea of public branding and added punishment, that typically applies more so to the American approach, where you're able to publicly access the sex offender registry. In terms of notification on its own, the idea is that having a registry alone isn't enough. Sometimes we're going to have individuals that are such high risk that what we need to do is be able to warn the community. And the idea there is that parents are supposed to go and warn their children of suspicious individuals, and the children are supposed to keep an eye out and then go to their parents if they see any odd behaviors. So with that, it sort of puts the responsibilization back into the community on the parent to keep their eyes peeled. And again, there's also the idea of the deterrence of reoffending. So real quick, primarily the difference between Canada and the US is this public versus private. So you guys can take a look as the little bits of small differences. But in Canada, what we have is we have one Ontario registry and then we have a national registry. Whereas in the States, each state has its own sex offender registry as well as one national registry. So the biggest difference really between the two, what we're seeing, is this online access. So open, this like combined system of notification registration, which we see in the States. We'll fly through this. Okay, so I talk about this idea of public notification and registration in the States and how they're linked. So what does this look like? So can I just go onto a website, for example, called Family Watchdog, and this is what comes up. So what we see here is this is a national registry. So if you look here, I can just do a little search here, and I'm going to put in a certain city, state. I can search by name. So all of this, I can put this in, and it's going to come up with a map of essentially dots, and dots are individuals that are on the sex offender registry. One other thing I want to point out here, because in the States everything can be purchased, right here, just for a certain fee, you can search an individual's name and purchase a background report on them. So last time I did this talk, I was in San Diego. So this is San Diego, 1.3 million people. All these dots are all different sex offenders within the community. So it's color coordinated for your viewing pleasure. And so what we have is offenses based against children, rape, sexual battery, and other offenses. So you can quite literally bring your cursor over and boom, pick one. I realized that because it's public, Daffy Duck isn't really on this individual's face, but I thought Daffy would be a good way to sort of protect his anonymity, although really at any point anyone can go in and get this information. So the information that's present, so you can see here, there's details, his aliases, convictions, description, map. You can print it out if you really need to have a map. So what's interesting is the idea behind this is so that individuals can have information so they can protect themselves. I don't know personally that having his actual apartment number is something that's necessary for me to protect myself and my family, unless there's questions of potential vigilante action. So vigilante action being people taking matters into their own hands, right? If this individual was working, went to school, or volunteered anywhere, that information would be here as well. So literally anywhere he can be found, that information is there. Like I said, you can print it out for wherever you need. I'm gonna skip past this one. So let's talk about some of the ethical concerns about sex offender registries and public notification. A lot of these concerns really apply more to the American approach. Some definitely can be applied to the Canadian approach, but like I said, it's a very different system that we have. So the first one is this idea that it's additional scrutiny that normal offenders are immune. So there's no registry for individuals who do break and enters, for example. Although people that commit break and enters have way higher recidivism rates than sex offenders. There's no register for individuals who committed murder, who has obviously, arguably, the most permanent effect of a crime, right? In addition, it's not fair to impose added measures for individuals as they have essentially paid their debt to society, right? So behind this, the rationale is that from a criminal justice perspective, it's not added punishment. They're not trying to shame the individual. That's not what this is intended to do. Really, it's more of an investigative tool, right? So that's sort of how they get around that specific ethical concern. One of the other really big things, if we go back to our friend Daffy Duck, there's nothing on the website that discusses anything about his risk level, okay? So what we can have is we can have individuals that are on the sex offender registry. We go back to those dots and I'm clicking around and I'm checking things out, but nothing tells me if this guy committed sexual assault, because that was his crime, versus And really, if you look at the facts of the case, the individual was out for a night drinking at a bar. At the end of the night, he slaps a woman on the buttocks. Things go a little too far, and he is arrested, and he is charged, and he goes on the sex offender registry. This individual, especially in the States, would go on the registry right along beside somebody who is like multi-victim rapist or somebody who has committed a number of sex crimes against children. But when you're sitting there in the community and you're looking at it, you actually have no idea the difference between these individuals because they're just faces and they're maps. That's all they see, right? So I'll skip that little part to stay on time. So another concern with all this is the question of vigilante action. So does this really happen? Do people really access the registry, get really angry about what's going on because they have children and they would never want to see their children harmed, and they act on this anger and go and hurt someone? And there are a number of different incidents, primarily within the States, but one example, probably about 10 years ago, is about an individual from New Brunswick. He was a 20-year-old man who accessed the Maine sex offender registry. And he went and he picked 2 names from the registry. He traveled down to Maine and he murdered both of those individuals prior to committing suicide. What was interesting was that one of the individuals that he murdered, he was on the sex offender registry for a statutory offense for having sex with his girlfriend, who was, there was a 3 or 4 year age gap. So he ended up being charged with this statutory offense, but at the time of his murder, he actually was still living with this woman, so they maintained a relationship. So that's one of those classic examples of vigilante actions. There's been numerous incidents where there would be mistaken identity, or the individual actually did what they said they were supposed to have done, but they're trying to reintegrate into the community, live a pro-social life, and they're being harassed. There's countless examples of homes being burned down, people being beaten. These are things that we're seeing way too often. The other idea here is that public notification draws unwanted attention to the victim. This is especially the case when we're looking at incidents of incest. So when the offender is someone that's related to the victim, right? So there's a public notification done on this individual. This child is trying to heal and move on, and it sort of rehashes old wounds. That's one of those arguments. As well, there's this argument that sex offender registries and notification provide a false sense of security. The idea with that is that when we look at the statistics and we look at the research, this idea of a predator lurking in the bushes, ready to like jump on unsuspecting victims, it's not the reality of what we see. The vast majority of individuals that are victims of sex crimes are known to the offender, right? So it's not somebody that's this stranger perpetrated crimes. This isn't really what we're seeing. We're seeing crimes by somebody that's either related or acquaintances or known to the victim. So it really perpetuates that false sense of security. In addition, research has looked at the issue of public notification, so having open registries, so just like you guys saw, but not providing any education to the community members. So you have a parent that's looking at this registry and they're like, okay, well, this is interesting. There's a sex offender here, 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 and they start to feel a little bit overwhelmed. I would feel overwhelmed if that's what I saw. But what's happening is they're given all this information, but they're not given any tools on how to deal with the information, no education on the reality of the situation. So it actually goes forward to instill more of a sense of fear than a sense of safety, which actually is counterintuitive for what we're looking at here, right? The last thing is the idea that public notification can drive offenders underground. So, especially by having open access registries like they do in the States, what you oftentimes see is individuals saying, you know what? I'm not going to go and I'm not going to register, I'm not going to comply, or I moved, I'm not going to tell anyone. And these individuals become non-compliant, especially with cases where their face is plastered everywhere for individuals to see. You see in situations where the individual starts to alienate themselves, they start to stop talking to their family, they stop going to treatment, and they start to really go underground. And this is the problem, because what we see now is this individual is at a heightened risk of recidivism. So research just actually indicated that if a person in the States, the study was done in the States, if a person was on the sex offender registry and becomes non-compliant, they're more than 2 times more likely to go on to sexually recidivate than a person that's compliant. That is huge. We don't want to see that, right? So especially in situations where you have open access registries, you're seeing a lot of that non-compliance, which I'll touch on in a minute. This is just one quick example of vigilante action. So this is a mother who was very proud of the fact that she so I jumped on his head myself. Pregnant woman is jailed for organizing gang beating of innocent man who was wrongly named on a pedophile vigilante website. So there's too many examples like this. So really quickly, I'm going to talk about the research. So okay, you know, there's this legislation. It's been implemented. Let's talk about whether or not it's effective, right? What are we seeing? The first most important thing that I want to talk to you about is the fact that the vast majority of the research I'm talking about is American-based. And what we know is within the States, we have this linked system of registration and notification. So it's incredibly difficult to generalize findings from the American to the Canadian. So really, we're going to be talking about the American context here. And there's just a little bit here. In terms of the research that's been done, this is what we're seeing. So, is research really giving us any big results? Yes, this is effective. No, it is not. Really, right now, nobody really knows. There's so many inconsistent findings that nobody can really make any generalizations. This is an interesting study. It's a federally funded study that looked at, again, these open, so your linked system of notification and registration. They found no significant effect on first-time offense rates, sexual recidivism, so going on to commit another sex offense, the offense, or the number of victims. So being on the registry and having it open had no impact on any of these. The authors question then, given the lack of impact on all these things, which is really what the legislation is hoping to do, should we be continuing to put money in this increasing registry if really we're not seeing any effect? Prescott and Rockoff, I love their work because they decided that it was really important to separate notification and registration. They said these are two different variables. We need to look at them separately. So when they did look at it, what they found was that sex offender registries are less effective when they're used with public notification. So when you have an open registry, it's not as effective. However, if you look at a registry only, so if you have a registry that is not open to the public, sex offender registries alone can impact the frequency of recidivism. What's interesting here is it was only impacted the frequency of recidivism if it's an average size SOR. So I think it was 16 registrants per 10,000 individuals. But that effect disappears when you have larger SORs. So when you have people that are going on registries for life, and you keep adding people onto this registry, everyone eventually is going to have a large SOR. So we're going to see a loss in any of the effect here. In terms of impact of public notification, they found that it has a slightly positive effect, although it wasn't significant, when the sex offender registry size was small. But again, over time, we're going to see these registries, and we have in the last 10 years, get bigger and bigger and bigger as you see all those dots. That's just one city, folks. You know, we have cities throughout the state, small cities. I frequently will pull up Watertown, which is just south of the border. Everyone knows where Watertown is. And there's a whole slew of dots, right? So if we keep adding these individuals, we're just going to see increased costs, and we're really not seeing any justification as whether or not it's working, right? So bottom line, sex offender registries may decrease recidivism, but it's only if they're smaller or average sized. Notification can counteract sex offender registry effectiveness. And public notification may have a slight deterrent effect only to first-time offenders. That's one of the things they found. Real quick on this, I want to talk a little bit about compliance. So the second point here. So like I had talked about before, there's this concern that if an individual becomes non-compliant, they're at an increased risk to recidivate. In Canada, we're doing pretty darn good. We're looking around 95%. Typically, compliance floats in and around 95%. In the States, we're constantly seeing examples of absolutely dismal compliance rates. So in Iowa, at one point, they took a assessment of the registry, and 40% of their registrants were missing. Their data was missing, so these individuals were no longer compliant. In California, I think it was like 46 at one point. That's almost half of the people on the registry in California that were supposed to be reporting, but at some point either just stopped reporting, completely walked away from everything, potentially went underground. So these are things that when we look at the data in the States, obviously we're concerned, right? One of the best things I think that we have going for us in Canada is the fact that we have a system of registration that is private, and that in Canada, when we do notification, which is very rare, it's a completely separate system. In terms of collateral consequences, and this is expected, right? When you look at these individuals that are trying to reintegrate back in the community, what are the collateral consequences of being on open registries? Difficulty obtaining employment or secure housing, financial loss, being ostracized by family, socially stigmatized and harassed. Well, if these are the consequences, then it's no wonder that we're seeing such dismal rates of compliance in the States. The only study that's been done on the Canadian side to date is a study that I did during my master's with Dr. Fedorov. And what we did is we talked about this idea that most people, especially because in the States, and it's all we knew from the research, right? Most people would think that being placed on a registry, that the registrant would find it very onerous and that they would have problems being on the registry and they would object to the rationale. We were hearing anecdotal experiences from our patients that were very different. We had one guy come in and say, actually, I don't mind being on the registry. Like, It's kind of like when I have to go and renew my driver's license. It's not a big deal. Another guy had said, yeah, it's not a big deal as long as they don't, they don't out me, so to speak. So when an individual goes and they register, the police within 2 weeks or so will go to their house to verify that that's where they're living. So they'll do it like a door knock, so essentially checking their residency. One of the individuals had said, my concern is when they come, I just really want them to come in a respectful manner so that they don't out me within the community, so to speak. Don't walk up to my door and be like, hi, we're the Ottawa Police, we're here to check because you're a sex offender. They just wanted a certain level of privacy, which makes sense. And in Ottawa, since the study, we've had some good discussion, they've been incredible in terms of doing some slight amendments in their protocol, and we've seen a lot of good feedback. All right, so that's all I'm going to do today. I'm just really going to quickly wrap up by just saying 48% of the individuals, they expressed that being on the warrant, being on the registry was not an onerous or intrusive experience. They actually only found it a mild irritant. That's a big number. And I really do believe, and a lot of them talked about this, that because the registries were private and they were dealing with respectful officers, that's why they weren't having an issue. And when I asked them, just real quick before we're done here, when I asked them, what would happen to you? How would you feel if registries were to go public in Canada like they were in the States? And when we talked about predicted impact on their future recidivism, it was generally split. Half said that they would have no impact, but interestingly enough, the other half said that it would negatively impact their likelihood of recidivism. What that means is it would make them more likely to go on to commit another sex crime. So it would aggravate the situation, which I find very interesting. And it was very clear. Almost all registrants expressed fear of vigilante, and some expressed intentions of going underground in the event that was ever to happen. So that is that. I'm done, and I somehow managed to do it in kind of my time. So at this point, I think we'll open it up to questions. We'll come and sit here, and we are ready. So whatever you guys have for us.